The State of the Science presentation that I'll be giving is looking at some work that I did with colleagues in Australia at the older age group of people who are moving from sheltered employment into retirement. And at the moment in Australia, the good news is that people are living longer, but that of course introduces new challenges as people age, because like the rest of the population they experience some age-related health problems and other issues, which means that it may not suit them any longer to work full time. But for many people in that situation, their main occupation and their main source of social connection is through their work, and so they're very anxious about losing that when they retire. The work that we did was to provide them with some pathways to transition to retirement, in particular to support people to join mainstream local community groups or volunteering opportunities where the people in the group had similar interests to themselves, and so that they'd be involved in activities with like-minded people and activities that they enjoyed. A key part of that was that we felt it was important that people receive appropriate support within the group in order to be able to do the activities, but also to be able to socialise with group members. And so we identified mentors within that group who volunteered to be mentors to support the person, and we provided them with some training in how to support the person to ensure that there was appropriate support, and that because those people were already members of those groups, that support was continuously available and readily available to them as they attended the group. One of the messages from research to date is that people with intellectual disability really don't know much about retirement and are really quite anxious about it and concerned about it, and have difficulty in imagining what life could be like when when they stop working. And so many are fearful that they will just stay at home and do nothing, lose contact with friends and go downhill. And they said that in as many words in some of the focus groups we had with them. So that's one area of research that was established to date. I think though the gap has been in identifying suitable and successful third age lifestyles for people with disabilities who are no longer working, partly because this is a relatively new issue in the sense that many more people are living to old age than was previously the case, which is great, but for the first time now the service system is confronting large numbers of people who are reaching the retirement age, and so the service system needs to think about developing pathways to support people to have a meaningful life after they've ceased working and to have strong social connections as well. The work that we've done on that particular project is almost completed, but we're working at the moment on trying to develop a similar project involving people who are working in competitive employment, because as I mentioned, all of the people who we've worked with to date are people who've worked in either sheltered employment or attended day programs. And I think some of the issues for people in competitive employment are a little different. One of them is that perhaps their employers, because they're in a business environment, may not be able to be as flexible in providing them with the opportunity to cut down their days of work without retiring fully, as we did with our project. Another element of that is that people who've been in competitive employment for some time in Australia, because of our retirement savings system, actually will have some money on retirement, and so that will open up some new opportunities for them in a way that isn't necessarily available to people who've had a lifetime of sheltered employment. And I think a third issue is that we'd like to take the research further beyond beginning the transition to retirement to taking the journey with people to full retirement and supporting them to develop a range of activities to form a lifestyle for them once they stop working altogether. One of the things that we did in the project is actually to make a DVD depicting the stories of some of the people involved and the types of things that they began to do as they transitioned to retirement. And we felt that that was potentially very beneficial because of the fact that, as I mentioned previously, that people really couldn't imagine an alternative to their current lifestyle. And so when asked what they wanted to do, often didn't have a clear answer to that question. And so it was somewhat more difficult to help them to find an appropriate group or volunteering opportunity to join, with the chance, by watching a video, to see people with some similarities to themselves doing a variety of different things that may help them to think about, well, maybe I could do that too, or maybe I could do something like that in my local community. And so they'll be able to articulate more clearly what they want so that people can support them to do that as they move towards retirement. Angela mentioned some examples of research gaps in her presentation, and I guess a couple of gaps that this presentation addresses as I talk about a project that I was involved in Australia, gaps around having a meaningful and socially inclusive third age when you retire from sheltered employment. And secondly, there's also the question of how we do social inclusion. Angela listed a number of approaches to social inclusion, and I think one of the contributions from our project is to nut out in a fair bit of detail some effective techniques for supporting social inclusion. We had a number of partners in Australia, and I acknowledge them and our funding source. The work was done in both Sydney and in Melbourne, though predominantly in Sydney. One important thing to understand is that in Australia there's no compulsory retirement age, so you can work until you die or beyond if you wish. So some of our participants were in their 70s and still working in a sheltered workshop and enjoying that. I want to give you some context about the participants and their views about retirement before we look at the data that arises from the project overall. We did focus groups with service users, disability service staff and family members, and all of those groups were anxious about retirement and perceived it as a risk to future well-being. I'm going to show you here some quotes from people with disability themselves, and as you can see from those quotes, people are concerned that they would be isolated socially at home and they would do nothing and they would go downhill. So the summary that I often say is you go home, you watch daytime TV and you wait to die. So there's got to be a better way. Our approach was to support people for 1 day a week, and this is a transition to retirement project. None of these, or few of these people retired fully. They reduced their days at work by 1 day and took up an alternative activity on that day, a socially inclusive activity in a mainstream community group of their choice, with support from mentors who were members of that group who we trained to provide support to them. That support included social support, and support for participation in activities. One of the features of the groups that we helped people to select for this was that they took place on a consistent day, the same day each week, at the same time and in the same place. That was partly to help people with disabilities have an understandable personal routine, but it was also a recognition that disability services function on routine, and anything that changed from week to week would be just too difficult to implement. One of the things that happened that seemed to work very well within the groups was to support the mentors and the person with the disability to identify a specific role within the group, a specific positive contribution that they could make to the group and take responsibility for with whatever support they needed from mentors. And I'll show you an example or two of that as we go along. We tried to be quite consciously person-centred in several ways. One of those ways that we had a rule that we only supported one person with a disability per community group, so that person interacted as an individual with their fellow group members, not as a member of a class of a group of people with disability who were sitting at the table in the corner. Additionally, we asked people about their interests and what kind of group they would like to join, and supported them to join a group where there were people who shared their interests, although eliciting those interests was often quite difficult, and I might get time to talk about that a bit more as we go along. I'm going to show you here a couple of examples of mentor support. As I said, there are examples of social support and support for activities. So here's an example of social support. So that's Graham signing in, as all volunteers do, to a community plant nursery where volunteers get together to pot seedlings which are used by the local community in parks, schools, roadside planting and so forth. And his mentor, Olympia. And here's an example of support for participation in activities and meaningful engagement. Olympia is helping Graham to learn how to do that actual potting. So I'll describe the intervention participants to you. We had 30 people in the intervention group. They were mostly men, age range 46 to 72, averaging 57 years. This group was a mixed group by primary disability. While the majority of people had a primary intellectual disability, there were also participants with other types of disabilities. The majority were in what's described here as supported employment, which is the term used in Australia to describe people who attend sheltered workshops. Sometimes a little bit euphemistically perhaps, but the majority of those people, as you can see, 17 of them worked part-time. So they were already at the stage where, because of ageing or age-related health conditions, they had reduced their days of work because they weren't able to cope successfully with full-time work anymore. People lived in a variety of living arrangements, including people living independently, group homes, hostels and with family. We also had a comparison group of people who were individually matched to those participants who continued to work in the same settings as usual, and those people were well matched by primary disability diagnosis, full-time or part-time employment or day program attendance, living arrangements and gender, but not surprisingly the comparison group were a few years younger than the intervention group, around about 3 years difference, and that difference was statistically significant. We gathered data before and after 6 months of attending a community group or volunteering opportunity for both the intervention and comparison groups. The one difference was that we also interviewed the intervention participants to get their views about retirement and about their participation in the community group. So let's turn to the outcomes that people reported to us and they experienced. I'm going to tell you firstly about information related to the intervention group only, and that of course is information about the number of people who were successful in attending a community group for 6 months, the nature of the groups that they joined, the change in their attendance at work or day program, and their views about their experiences after 6 months of doing that. So this gives you a bit of a flow chart of those 30 people, and the people who joined a community group and successfully continued there for a minimum of 6 months are shown in the yellow boxes there. So we started with 30, 27 of whom, or 90%, continued for at least 6 months, and 21 of whom, still the majority, are continuing today, some 2.5 years after they started. A small number didn't finish the 6-month intervention for various reasons depicted there, and a small number ceased attending after 6 months or longer. Sometimes it was 12 or 18 months later for various reasons, some related to health, some because they decided to return to work. The nature of the groups that they attended was really varied, and I think this speaks to the individualisation that was happening in the project. You can see there's a wide variety of things there, from the Cat Protection Society to a community choir, to lawn bowls, to 10-pin bowls, to community gardens, seniors groups, walking groups and so forth. Some of those groups by design were single-sex groups, so there were a number of men who attended men's sheds. That's a peculiarly Australian phenomenon which is now moving to other countries, and I'll tell you more about that if you wish. And there was an exercise group which was female only by design, because the ladies, when they got on the lycra, didn't want blokes hanging around while they were doing their exercise. But there are also community groups that were single gender, not by design but by circumstance. So the Cat Protection Society was an all-female volunteer group, as it happened, and the charity shop, the participant worked in the sort of outlying bookstore, which was an all-male environment for some reason. So there we have it. And that distinction that I've made there on the chart between volunteering and a community group is an important one for people with a disability in Australia, in that if they're recipients of the disability support pension, they also receive what's called the mobility allowance, which is a quite significant payment of over $40 a week to pay for travel using public transport or other travel to enable them to attend their program. And if they continue to do volunteering for 8 hours a week or more on average, they continue to be eligible for that payment. So that's an important piece of knowledge if you're transitioning from employment where you automatically get that payment to some post-employment lifestyle. As you can see here, most people reduced their work by 1 day a week, so an average of 7 hours a week. There were a handful of people who chose, instead of reducing their days of work, to use one of their existing days off because they were working part-time to do the activity that I described, but that was less frequent. The people's views about the participation in the groups were universally positive. People talked about doing this for the rest of their life. They enjoyed attending the group. They talked about the people in the group and how they were so nice and how they look after me, they talk to me, and sometimes I help them. So there was also that element of mutuality in the interactions. It wasn't all one way. And no participants voiced any negative views about the groups that they attended or the people in them. As I mentioned, we also did comparisons between the intervention and the comparison group on a variety of assessments of depression, life events, loneliness, social satisfaction and quality of life. Predominantly they were self-report instruments, but amongst our participants we had a number of people who were, because of communication difficulties, weren't able to self-report, so we also included some proxy assessments which were completed for all of the participants. Bearing in mind that the views of both the people themselves and their families and service providers about retirement were quite negative, and their expectations were of deterioration. The fact that we found no difference between these two groups on most of the measures, we are inclined to interpret as a positive finding. There was one significant difference, and that was related to social satisfaction, and I'll break that out a bit more in a minute, and that was favouring the intervention group who attended the community groups or volunteering. Just to reinforce that point about the change that people experience as they reduce their work and retire, I've reproduced here all of the PASAD life events items which talk about stressful life events that can be associated with negative experiences and increased risk of psychopathology. And 3 of those, as you can see, are related to changed work arrangements or retirement. So, it's widely recognised that these changes can in fact be stressful and have negative consequences. So we would argue that the findings of no difference are in some way encouraging, in that despite the fact that people partly retired and only a small number fully retired, they weren't experiencing negative consequences associated with that change in their work arrangements. Let me go into the issue of social satisfaction a bit more. That it comes from a 12-item self-report scale called the Worker Loneliness Questionnaire, which has 2 factors. One of those factors is an aloneness factor, which is about loneliness per se, and one of those is a social satisfaction factor, which talks about people's satisfaction with the support and social connections that they feel. So I've reproduced the items there, so you can see examples of the items in relation to social satisfaction at the bottom. Do you have people to talk to? Do you have lots of friends? Can you find a friend when you need one? So these are all items about having friends and having social support from friends. And if we look at the social satisfaction data here, and these are not raw data, these are corrected means using pre-test social satisfaction as a covariate, there was a significant difference between the intervention group that had higher social satisfaction and the comparison group. And as you can see there, a quite large effect size, partial eta squared of 0.20, which corresponds to a large effect size. So we think these are reasonably robust findings. Breaking that down still further, by pre-test and post-test by group, you can see there that the intervention group on the left increased their social satisfaction over the 6 months from pre-test to post-test from 10.5 to 11.4. And that increase was statistically significant. There was a slight but non-significant decrease in social satisfaction in the comparison group. So that experience of having friends and social support from friends appears to have increased in the intervention group, and it's highly probable that that can be attributed to their experiences in joining those groups and being involved. So let me give you a couple more DVD clips from the DVD of the project where the participants themselves talk about their experiences of social satisfaction and how that felt to them. I'll start with Graham, who describes his enjoyment of the activities at the nursery, of travelling to the nursery and of the people there.
I like it here. And all that, knowing all the friends and that, and getting from Richmond to here. Yeah, let's see what.
And then Laurie, who joined a community choir, talks about his experiences there and the social interactions that he enjoys there.
One of my favourite cakes of them all.
Really? What's another favourite?
What I do, I go and communicate, talk to ladies,
Banana cake's my favourite too.
give them a chat. It's part of my job to give them make new friends, give them a chat, and they help me and I help them.
So once again, that reciprocity. They help me and I help them. There are a few technical issues around some of the non-significant findings. We have some missing data because people are unable to self-report, and there are also some difficulties in responding to some of the scales that we chose to include, which were mainstream scales designed for the general community because we wanted to make comparisons with available norms in that community, but a number of the items proved too difficult for many of our participants, and so we had a lot of missing data as a result. So overall, we believe that we had good success with this project, and we're very largely successful in supporting people to join and continue to attend groups with the input of mentors from those groups. A few cautions. Our participant group were mostly people in sheltered workshops with mild or moderate disability. There were a few people with more severe disability. They had no evident challenging behaviour, although we didn't assess that formally, and although some of them had some significant self-care needs, they were capable of managing their own self-care. The extent to which this could be replicated with people without those characteristics remains to be seen. We can't comment on that because they didn't take part in our project. I won't go through all of the information on the screen here in detail. You can have a look at it in the PowerPoint if you wish. But I think the fact that people were significantly more socially satisfied and experienced a high level of social interaction in their participation in the groups once a week are related. It's important to note, and this is a comment that Angela made as well, that people did not have contact with friends from the group outside of the group. The only contact that they tended to experience was within the group once a week. Having said that, I think that was also reasonably common for other group members without intellectual disability. But there were high levels of social interaction while they were attending the group. So those are some contact details. And lastly, I want to mention to you a couple of resources that I brought along with me, and I don't want to take them back to Australia, so I want you to come and gather them up and take them with you. The main one, those short DVD clips come from a much longer DVD called Transition to Retirement. I've got 6 or 7 copies of that here, which people are welcome to take. There are a few people in the room to whom I've already sent copies, so please don't double dip. That full DVD is also available online, and there's a flyer about that here as well, so you can look at that online. And lastly, there are some copies of a journal article that myself and colleagues published at the beginning of this project, outlining the rationale underpinning this approach to social inclusion that you might find interesting as well. Thank you.